The Big Three, a detailed examination. The term the Big Three is central to understanding the political and military dynamics of the Allied powers in World War II. It refers primarily to the three principal leaders: Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States, Winston Churchill of the United Kingdom, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, and by extension, the powerful nations they represented. Their alliance was a marriage of necessity against a common, formidable enemy. But it was fraught with ideological differences, strategic rivalries, and personal suspicions that would shape the post-war world.
Winston Churchill, United Kingdom. As the Prime Minister from 1940, Churchill was the first of the three to be in a state of all-out war with Nazi Germany. He embodied British resolve during its finest hour, standing alone against the Axis after the fall of France. His primary goals were the survival of the British Empire, the total defeat of Germany, and the establishment of a stable, democratic Europe. He was deeply suspicious of Stalin's intentions from the outset. 2. Franklin D. Roosevelt, United States. The president who led the U.S. out of isolationism, Roosevelt provided critical support to Britain through Lend-Lease even before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought America formally into the war. His vision was for a post-war world governed by a new international organization, the United Nations, and built on the four freedoms. He often acted as a potential mediator between Churchill's imperialism and Stalin's communism, believing he could personally handle Uncle Joe. 3. Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union. The dictator of the USSR, Stalin had initially signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939. The German invasion in June 1941 forced him into the Allied camp. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the war in Europe, suffering immense casualties. Stalin's goals were starkly pragmatic: secure his western borders by creating a buffer zone of friendly states in Eastern Europe, obtain massive economic reparations from Germany, and gain recognition as a world power. The evolution of the alliance and key conferences. The relationship between the Big Three was not static, it evolved with the fortunes of war. The special relationship. Initially, Churchill and Roosevelt formed a very close bond, cemented by the Atlantic Charter of 1941, which outlined their vision for a post-war world based on self-determination and collective security. At this stage, the UK and US were the dominant partners. The turning point, the Tehran Conference, 1943. This was the first face-to-face meeting of all three leaders. The dynamics began to shift. Stalin's demands for a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the USSR were finally met with a commitment to D-Day. Churchill's preferred soft underbelly strategy in the Mediterranean was sidelined. Stalin, whose armies were now advancing, gained parity at the table. The apex, the Yalta Conference, February 1945. By Yalta, the war's outcome was clear, but the post-war landscape was not. The Soviet Red Army already occupied most of Eastern Europe. Key agreements and disagreements emerged. Germany, agreement to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, including one for France, and to demand its unconditional surrender. Poland, this was the most contentious issue. Stalin demanded a government friendly to the USSR. A compromise was vaguely reached on a reorganized government including pro-Western politicians, with a promise of free and unfettered elections, a promise Stalin would later break. United Nations, Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan after Germany's defeat in exchange for territorial concessions in Asia. They also finalized the voting structure for the new United Nations. At Yalta, Roosevelt's declining health was evident, and the US's need for Soviet help against Japan gave Stalin significant leverage. The successors, the Potsdam Conference, July-August 1945. This conference marked the end of the original Big Three. Roosevelt had died in April, replaced by Harry S. Truman. Churchill was replaced mid-conference by Clement Attlee after losing the British election. The dynamic changed dramatically. Truman, more blunt and suspicious of Stalin than Roosevelt, he famously informed Stalin of the successful atomic bomb test, a move meant to deter Soviet ambitions. Attlee, focused on domestic British recovery, he was less influential in the power dynamic. The conference dealt with the practicalities of post-war Europe, reparations, the shifting of Poland's borders, and the Potsdam Declaration demanding Japan's surrender. The cracks in the alliance were now open and widening. The complex web of relationships. As noted, the relationships within the Big Three were asymmetrical. Roosevelt and Churchill. This was the closest bond, built on a shared language, ideology, though Churchill was an imperialist and Roosevelt anti-colonial, and frequent communication. They met 11 times. Roosevelt and Stalin. Roosevelt believed he could charm and manage Stalin, often downplaying Churchill's warnings. He hoped that post-war cooperation was possible, a view Stalin may have exploited. Churchill and Stalin. This was the most strained relationship. Churchill never trusted Stalin, famously stating in 1942 that Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Stalin, in turn, viewed Churchill as the arch-imperialist and was suspicious of British and American delays in opening the Second Front, which he saw as a plot to let the USSR bleed. The practice of two leaders discussing the third behind his back was common, reflecting the underlying tensions and the constant jockeying for position. Legacy and historical interpretation. The legacy of the Big Three is profound and double-edged. Success. They achieved their primary, unifying goal, the total military defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Their cooperation was essential for coordinating massive armies and industrial production. Failure. They failed to build a lasting peace. The very disagreements they papered over during the war, primarily over the fate of Eastern Europe, erupted into the Cold War almost immediately after 1945. Historians often debate who won the negotiations. A common interpretation is that Stalin emerged as the most successful in achieving his immediate, tangible goals. He secured a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, a divided Germany, and a recognized superpower status for the USSR, all while his nation suffered catastrophic losses. Roosevelt and Churchill, despite their military victory, are often seen as having made significant concessions, particularly at Yalta, either out of necessity, needing the Soviet army, or misplaced optimism, Roosevelt's belief in post-war cooperation. The story of the Big Three is the story of World War II and the dawn of the Cold War. It is a dramatic narrative of how necessity forged an unlikely alliance between democracy and totalitarianism, and how, once the common enemy was vanquished, their fundamental incompatibilities reshaped the world for decades to come.